Okay, we have the dangers of being nostalgic about the past and historical reenactments. So my thesis was, while historical reenactments offer a nostalgic connection to past events and foster a sense of cultural identity, it can also romanticize history and lead to misinterpretations about the past and flawed understanding of historical events. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, better record-keeping practices and more public interest in history led to people starting to do historical reenactments where they would dress up in historical clothing and recreate events that happened in the past. They would typically be wars or stuff like that, but the nostalgia used in these reenactments of the past can be misleading. It would encourage focus on the positive aspects of history while ignoring the darker realities, like the heroism of the Union in the Civil War, rather than like the horrors that actually took place during it, like the total war waged against Confederate civilians, or the fact that after the conclusion of the Civil War, things weren't perfect. Like it didn't actually end there. Not only this, but storytelling is also at the heart of historical reenactments, which is why they're such a good tool for learning about the past and connecting us to our culture in general. They give us a sense of belonging and identity, but the way we tell the stories matter. So reenactments use storytelling to make history come alive. When done accurately, they can preserve traditions and educate people, but if stories are filled with inaccuracies or nostalgia, they can distort our understanding of the past. And as researcher Jennifer Aker points out, telling stories filled with nostalgia can be just as harmful as not talking about them at all. This leads us to what Ali Mazura calls cultural amnesia, when we ignore the negative parts of our history and only remember the good. For example, many U.S. Reenactments gloss over the realities of slavery or violence, creating a simpler version of the past. For example, the photo right here shows what the Civil War was actually like, and this shows how the Civil War is depicted in many reenactments. So it shows a much simpler, like almost comical view of the Civil War, when in reality it really was horrific for everyone involved. An example of this modern day would be Hamilton, which is a historical reenactment that is sometimes used in educational settings, but it's important to, when using media examples like this, that we realize that it oversimplifies the role of slavery and even portrays some slave-owning founding fathers as abolitionists, like Hamilton himself, when in reality his views on the subject typically swapped back and forth depending on what would give him more political advantage, painting them as heroes and people to idolize, when in reality they just wanted whatever would give them the most votes in general. And some people argue that reenactments have real educational and social value. When done accurately, that is true. They can make history more engaging and memorable than just like textbooks. And nostalgia itself isn't always bad, especially in relation to historical reenactments. It can help build a community and inspire people to learn. But these reenactments they don't outweigh the risks of forgetting the important parts of history. For example, Johann Norberg did a survey where he found that 41% of Americans believe life was better 50 years ago. And here I have a graph that shows how many people from different countries believe that life was better many years ago. He also found that people that are alive now think that the peak of America was the 1950s, when people alive in the 1950s remember being afraid of nuclear war, the death of the American family, or whether or not technology was going to end the world. When people in the 1950s want to go back to the 1920s and they remember that being the peak of America, or they think it would, but people born or alive in the 1920s remember it was really not all that good, and they want to go back to the simplicity of the 1800s, and they found that this pattern was apparent throughout all history. Reenactments often focus on heroism and ignore the uncomfortable parts like racism, violence, and the aftermath of war. For example, Civil War reenactments rarely address the realities of Reconstruction or the rise of the Lost Cause movement after the conclusion of the war. And the selective storytelling can be dangerous because it encourages a nostalgic but inaccurate view of history, meaning it gets people to think about history as like the good old days rather than a real time where real people lived and there were actually problems. So what can we do to solve this? One solution would be to include debriefings after reenactments, not like a lecture because that's typically not a very good way to connect with people, but if we had a professional that could do it in a Q&A format session or something like that, where they address not only like military tactics but also like economic and social factors of different wars, and then it can also talk about the experiences of African Americans during different eras throughout the United States, because typically a lot of reenactments show that part of life. And a key component should be examining like the Lost Cause mythology that romanticizes the Confederacy, because one of the main reenactments that takes place in the United States is Civil War reenactments. And this way we can help like confront interpretations where people are thinking like about the heroism of the Union rather than about the real people that lived on both sides of the conflict, and the fact that it didn't just end after the final battle of the Civil War. Yeah.
Thank you, Grace. I'm going to ask you two questions. The first is about your topic and your question. Did your research, well, this is a yes or no question, so I don't want you to give me a yes or no answer.
Okay.
Did your research go in a different direction than you originally planned or hypothesized?
Initially, I was thinking that after I read My Mother's House, I decided that I wanted to explore how storytelling relates to how we remember the deceased. And then I realized once I started researching that I wanted to take a slightly different route and think about how we remembered history rather than the dead, because I thought it was a little bit easier to find examples, because I think it's a lot more up to interpretation what remembering the dead actually means, and I found history was much more of a solid thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's see. What additional questions emerged from your research that might be important?
Well, I was thinking about whether or not I realized when I was researching that sometimes there were people that thought forgetting the bad parts of the past was actually a positive thing. Like, for example, when people were remembering King Arthur, it led to chivalry and stuff like that, and that was remembering the good aspects of what his imagined life was, but it wasn't necessarily thinking. I didn't incorporate much of that view into my thing, but I think that it was an interesting stance on the topic, and it would have been more interesting to delve into. So.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.